been with Budweiser Budvar. Can you tell us how did you first become aware of the Budweiser Budvar Brewery and beers?
Well, back in the late 70s, I read Michael Jackson's book, The World Guide to Beer, and I knew about the American beer called Budweiser. I had no idea, because in those days Czechoslovakia was behind the Iron Curtain. I had no idea there was a beer with the same name, which fascinated me. And 10 years later, about 1988, I went to Czechoslovakia, and I'd arranged through Čedok, which is the Czech travel agency, to go to the brewery and meet the general manager. When I got there, he wasn't there. They told me he'd gone to Prague. We probably passed each other on the train, so I couldn't get into the brewery. And a couple of years later, I went back and I was allowed in, but only allowed to sit in his office with a glass of beer, but I wasn't allowed to see the brewery. It was only in the 90s, after the fall of communism, that I was allowed into the brewery and realised what an amazing place it was. And I became very, very friendly with the wonderful Joseph Tolar, the head brewer, who'd been there since, I think the 1950s. And Yuri Bocek, the manager, who put up a spirited campaign to stop the Americans taking over and buying the brewery.
And when did that threat of potential takeover of the brewery become apparent?
Well, to my astonishment, Mr. Bocek told me that the Americans had been to the brewery back in the 80s when it was still under communism, and they presented Budvar with a very nice wooden horse-drawn dray. The dray pulling American Budweiser, very attractive thing, but of course in those days there was no question of the Czech government allowing the Americans to buy the brewery.
It was only after the fall of communism and the breakup of the Soviet Union that there was a potential threat became apparent. Yeah?
Yes, that's right. Yeah, yes. Anheuser-Busch, the brewers of American Budweiser, actually opened an office in České Budějovice, and they were there as a sort of unbenign influence, trying to put pressure on the brewery and also the new Czech government and the people in the town of České Budějovice to allow them to take over the brewery. And everybody said, no, this is the jewel in our brewing crown. We have these wonderful, amazing beers in Czechoslovakia. We have the original Pilsner Urquell, and we have this beautiful beer, Budweiser Budvar. There's no question of allowing it to be bought by the Americans.
And you and Camera and some other beer writers from the UK became quite involved in the campaign. How did that come about?
Yes, I mean, it was very much a Camera initiative. I think I can probably claim that I put the pressure on Camera to take up the cudgels on behalf of Budvar. But I mean, Camera is not just about real ale. We're in defence of genuine traditional beer styles in other parts of the world. And of course, these proper lager beers are part of the great tradition of European brewing. And I went out with Camera's chief executive, Mike Benner, on several occasions, and we made quite spirited speeches in defence of Budvar. There's a famous bar in Prague, the Little Bears, which sells Budvar beer. I remember standing on a top of a wagon which they put into the pub, where I made a speech in defence of the brewery. There was a big crowd there. I imagine they didn't understand a single word I said, but I got a big standing ovation at the end of it.
And how has the brewery responded to this interest from the UK?
I think they were at first astonished that anybody in Britain had heard of them, and then really pleased that we were defending them. And there was an amazing event sometime in the 1980s. Ian Dobson, who was Camera's office manager, phoned me and said that the London office of AB InBev had phoned to say that one of their top men from America was over in Britain and wanted to see us, and in particular wanted me to go along to the meeting. So Ian Dobson and I went along to the meeting, and this man from AB InBev said, not AB InBev, from Anheuser-Busch as it then was, said he wanted Camera to support their bid to take over Budvar. And we just fell on the floor laughing and said, look, don't be ridiculous. Of course we're not going to support your campaign. And then we went back to the office in St Albans. When we got back, the phones were ringing red hot. And Dennis Cox, who was then Budvar's PR man in this country, said, "What on earth is going on?" Anheuser-Busch had put out a press statement saying CAMRA supports their campaign to buy Budvar. And we said, absolute nonsense. So I hammered out a press release, which I faxed to Dennis. And Dennis, with all his wonderful contacts in Prague, put out this press release. And even Václav Havel, the president, made a comment about it, saying that Budvar was not for sale to the Americans. And I'm delighted to say that the man from Anheuser-Busch got the sack.
And so that contribution you made to the independence of the brewery has been honoured. You've got your own tankard of the brewery. Later you were given a certificate thanking you for support. You've had many accolades over the years. How do those rank alongside other awards that you've received?
Oh, I think the cup that I have at the brewery, which is numbered 1968, is actually a very emotional thing to me, because 1968 was the year of the Prague Spring, when they attempted to overthrow the old regime, and of course the Soviets responded by sending in the tanks. But in the end, liberty was brought back to what is now the Czech Republic. So I think having my tankard at the brewery with 1968 on it is far and away, I think, the finest thing I have in my collection.
Great. And where today would you rank Budweiser Budvar with the world's great lagers?
Oh, it's right up there in the top 10, probably in the top 3. I think that many people in this country don't quite realise what proper lager is and how it's made. I remember going to Carlsberg a few years ago. They took a big party of journalists and brewers to Copenhagen to celebrate 170 years of brewing at Carlsberg. Fascinating trip. And one of the top brewers there said, "We have taken the lagering out of lager." And we said, "What do you mean?" And he said, "In this day and age with modern yeasts and modern technology, you don't need to lager beer for months." So I said, "What would you say to Budvar, who aged their beer for 90 days? And he said, "They're wasting their time." And just 1 week after that, I met Peter Dvořák, the new manager at Budvar, and told him what the man from Carlsberg had said, and he just gave a wry smile because they've got no intention of changing the way in which they make the beer. And I think that what we have to emphasise to beer lovers in other countries is that lagering means aging beer properly, aging beer for weeks, months. In the case of Budvar, 90 days lagering. And to me, even though I've been to the brewery many times, to me one of the fascinating things about the visit is to go down into the lager cellars just above freezing point, where they will tap a tank at 1 month where the beer is green and not very nice, 2 months beginning to come together, then after 3 months is that sublime beer, that lovely blend of malt and hops and a little hint of apple fruit, which seems to be the hallmark of beers from that part of the world. And it's just a delicious beer, a lovely beer. It's so different to what passes for lager produced by the big global brewers.
That's a lovely note to end on, Roger. Thank you very much for talking to us today. Much appreciated.
My pleasure.